Welcome to APRV Part 3 from www.10ceu.com. If you didn't see Parts 1 and 2, you may want to see it. The storyline just gets all messed up if you start from Part 3 and go backwards. Hey, and if you like to click on things, click the like button on this video, and also please be sure to subscribe so you can always keep up to date on all the current videos that we will be releasing. Without further ado, let's get right into today's topic. So now we're going to start talking about initial settings. And as we move further in this discussion, I think it's important to note the following. If you go out and start reading all the studies and papers out on this mode of ventilation, here's the one thing you're going to find out. Just about nobody really agrees on everything there is to do on this mode. So what I suggest for normal settings, for initial settings, someone else might suggest something slightly different. And that's cool. It's all right to do things a little bit different, but the important thing is no matter how we do it, we should understand physiologically why we're doing what we're doing. It's not good enough to say, hey, I think we should put this setting in a vent. And they say, why? Well, we tried it before on someone else and hey, it worked. I mean, that's not a physiological explanation. It's sure not going to garner you a lot of respect that you really know what you're doing with this particular mode. So, as we talk about these things, we're going to talk about the physiology behind them. And we're going to start out with P high. P, of course, stands for pressure. So it's the high pressure during the inspiratory phase of this ventilation. Now, some simply set this at the level of their mean airway pressure on the current mode of ventilation. I've seen some people set it on their mean airway pressure and they add 2 centimeters of pressure. I've seen some people who will set it at their plateau pressure. So there's various ways which you can do. Either one of those really is just fine. Plateau pressure, mean airway pressure, whatever. It's all going to pretty much get you a good initial setting. And the thing to remember is the initial setting is just that. It's an initial setting. Okay. Now here is a more complicated way of figuring out P high. I'm only going to cover it because you might have seen this before. Basically what they do in this situation is they'll calculate the PF ratio after drawing a blood gas. And based on the PF ratio, you can see that they're going to use a mean airway pressure on the right-hand column as suggested. And then what they do is they'll add 3 centimeters above that mean airway pressure as a good way to start the P high. I think this is a lot of extra steps that are kind of unnecessary and they complicate the situation. But hey, if it works for you, no worries. Go ahead and give it a shot. Now your next setting is called PEEP or P low, depending on which ventilator you're using. And this is typically set at 0. And the reason why is we want our patient to auto PEEP. Why do we want them to auto PEEP? Good question. We'll answer that later. Oftentimes when I ask people, why do we set PEEP at 0? They say, yeah, because we want the patient auto PEEP. And I followed up with the very question I just asked. Why? And most people don't know the physiological reason why they want to create auto PEEP as opposed to just having set PEEP. We'll cover that. All right. But right now, usually we set it 0. Now, there are exceptions to every rule. Okay. If you have an infant that you're using bivent, or maybe a pediatric, somebody who has a cuffless airway, you may have to set a little peepage on here, because if no matter how low you set your T low, which creates the auto PEEP, sometimes you just can't create enough auto PEEP because you have that cuffless airway and such a large leak. So therefore, sometimes, yeah, you got to set some PEEP. The only other time I've ever seen having to set PEEP is patients on ECMO. Okay, and sometimes when the patient's on ECMO, they're going to use this mode to try to maintain some sort of alveolar recruitment so we have something more patent to work with when the patient comes off. And I've seen lungs that are so stiff that no matter how low I set the T low, I still can't create auto PEEP. So again, in cases like that, there are instances where we have to set some level of PEEP. T high, of course, T stands for tie, so this is the time high, or how long we're going to keep our P high set for. This one's a little more widespread. If you read through all the literature, I've seen it set anywhere from 3 to 6 seconds for initial setting. So 4.5 seconds kind of falls in between that, so that's a good starting point. There's really no physiology or math behind that to really get hung up on. I usually start around 3.5, 4 seconds, whatever, you know, right in that range, you're still going to be good. Again, the moment you switch modes, you could be looking at certain values to see if you have to make immediate changes. Now T low, this one gets a little more scientific, typically between 0.5 and 1 second. Okay, the key here is it's going to be low enough not to allow complete exhalation to create the auto PEEP. Remember we said we're not setting PEEP. This is how we're going to create auto PEEP. If the patient has too short an expiratory time, they don't have time to exhale all the air out of the lungs, they create some form of auto PEEP. And how much auto PEEP is enough? Well, that's a good question. We're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. So just hang on. So here's a fun little slide. Basically what I did is I did a Google search of 3 of the top vent companies and found screenshots of what their ventilators look like in this particular mode. And as you can see, there's quite a difference between the 3. So why are we not gonna set PEEP? Well, again, there's actually a physiological reason behind all of this. Now remember the goal of Aprv slash bivent slash bilevel is to sort of mimic inverse ratio ventilation. Now it's not a true inverse ratio again because the patient should be spontaneously breathing in this mode. Now remember the 3 advantages that we talked about earlier, and this is way back in 1. That's why I said if you haven't seen video 1, you need to look at it. And those 3 advantages, just as a reminder, improve oxygenation, improve alveolar recruitment, and it will help pulmonary edema. Now, the stronger the I to E ratio, the better the results are going to be with this kind of a patient. So the shorter the T low, the stronger the I to E ratio is going to be. So if we actually set PEEP, and then we need to increase the T low because now maybe the set PEEP plus our auto PEEP is too much and we're having some cardiovascular side effects, and the doctor won't let us get rid of the set PEEPs. The only way to get rid of any PEEP is to get rid of that auto PEEP. So we have to increase that T low. And as we increase the T low, we're actually going to decrease the ID ratio, thus minimizing the intended effects of this mode of ventilation. All right, here's an example. So you have the following settings. You have a P high of 20, a T high of 4, and a T low of 0.5. Well, in this case, your ID ratio is 8 to 1, because 4 divided by 0.5 equals 8. Now, the doctor sets a PEEP of 5. And now you notice the cardiovascular side effects may be in the form of decreased blood pressure. So what you need to do is you have to decrease your PEEP level, like we said before, in order to prevent this problem. And since I can't get rid of the set PEEP, we're going to assume the physician will not allow us to get rid of set PEEP. I'm now going to increase that T low just like mentioned. So let's just increase the T low by 0.3 of a second. All right, mostly because it's easy on the mathematics here, right? So we go to a T low of 0.8. Look what happens. The I to E ratio goes from an 8 to 1 to 5 to 1 ID ratio in 0.3 of a second. That's significant. And it's going to play a factor in the improvements we're trying to make using this particular mode. Now, how do we determine that the T PEEP or T low is set appropriately? How do we know if if we have enough auto PEEP or too much auto PEEP? Basically, in this example, the middle waveform, it's our flow waveform, you need to look at the expiratory flow. And basically, if there's no auto PEEP, the base flow is going to go back to 0, right? It's going to go back to baseline before the next breath begins. In this example, you can clearly see where the inspiratory phase occurs, long before the expiratory phase completely returns to baseline. And now this indicates auto PEEP. And typically, you want this line to be about 1/2 to 1/3 of the initial expiratory phase. Okay, so if you look at the expiratory phase, initially it goes very fast, all right, and it starts to slow down. It's just like how we exhale. So we exhale, our expiratory flow rate's very high and it slows down. And we want our auto PEEP to be about 50 to 75% of our peak expiratory flow rate. Studies have shown that that is the best place to determine optimal PEEP, okay, for this particular mode of ventilation. Now, there's things you can do, like you could go ahead Some people do an expiratory hold to try to get auto PEEP, but here's the problem. If you do an expiratory hold to try to measure auto PEEP, that's only going to work if the patient's making no spontaneous effort, because if they're making a spontaneous effort during the expiratory hold, that number is going to be inaccurate. So you cannot rely on the accuracy of that number to determine how much auto PEEP truly exists if the patient's making any effort. Here's just another way to try to understand Aprv. I try to make this as simple as you can to understand it. Aprv can also be called or described as interrupted CPAP. Of course, we know that CPAP is a spontaneous mode of ventilation. So remember, that's the goal of Aprv, to have this patient breathing spontaneously. Now, the first thing I've got to do is I've got to apologize for these crude drawings. Yeah, I drew these. And as you look at these drawings, you're going to clearly see why I chose to be a respiratory therapist and not go into the artistic endeavors, all right? I mean, I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. That's how bad my drawing is, guys. Anyway, what this drawing is supposed to represent is it shows a spontaneous breathing patient with a time pressure waveform. And there's no PEEP set. So what we see here is during the expiratory phase, the expiratory pressure drops to 0. So this patient's in CPAP. We get CPAP. They're spontaneously breathing. CPAP's at 0, so baseline pressure during the expiratory phase is 0. Easy to understand. So now what we have done is we got the same patient still on CPAP, and we decided we should increase the overall PEEP to 5. Okay, so now when the patient exhales, they're no longer exhaling all the way to a baseline of 0. All we've done is increase the baseline so they exhale to 5 centimeters of pressure, correct? Still spontaneously breathing, very easy to understand, nothing difficult here. Now, to make things real complicated, what we've done here is increase the PEEP from 5 to 10. So again, nothing complicated. We're in CPAP. All we've done is change the baseline pressure. So during the expiratory phase, they stop the expiratory phase at 10 centimeters of pressure. Again, all this is stuff we understand, nothing up the sleeves. So now here comes a problem. Either you're looking at a chest x-ray or maybe your patient's oxygen saturations aren't good, but there's some reason why you're deciding that we need to go higher on the set level of PEEP. Okay. Now, how high can you go on PEEP before it's too much for the patient to be able to effectively exhale against? You got to remember, PEEP, although it does help the patient not de-recruit during the expiratory phase, it does create expiratory resistance. So at some point, that expiratory resistance is going to be too much for the patient to exhale effectively against. And how much that's going to be is different depending on which patient we're doing. Everybody's different on what they can handle. But at either rate, at some point, it's going to start impeding expiratory flow. When we get to this point, we may want to switch over to bilevel or Aprv or bivent, whatever you want to call it, okay? So what we do is we switch them over. In this case, instead of a PEEP, we turned the P high. P high kind of replaced my PEEP, and I set the P high at 20 centimeters of pressure. And now what's happened is we built in these little interrupted phase. Remember T high and T low? And you can see that line going across as an interruption. The patient's still spontaneously breathing, but all we have done is created interrupted CPAP. That's all this is. So we get all the benefits of inverse ratio ventilation while allowing the patient to spontaneously breathe throughout the entire inspiratory and expiratory phase of ventilation. Cooler than air conditioning. Now, I also want to take the time to talk about pressure support. Now, obviously, in CPAP, we usually have a little bit of pressure support set to help the patient take a good spontaneous breath. And in some versions of this particular mode, you can put in pressure support, and some you can't. So do you want to put pressure support on a patient in this mode of ventilation? It's important to understand that in the initial rollout of Aprv, you couldn't do this. This was not an option. So why would we use it? Okay, on the ventilator, you'll have return volumes being measured from the vent. And oftentimes what happens, I get a physician say, you know what, I want pressure support. And I'll say, why? And they're looking at these return volumes. Now they have these large dumping tidal volume breaths that comes from the machine during that T low. But during the T high, while the patient's spontaneously breathing, the spontaneous tidal volume that's reading back is usually generally pretty small. Well, if you look at this great drawing I drew here, that shaded image up top, that is the tidal volume representation that's being measured. You got to remember, we're holding the patient's lung almost to maximum inspiration already, so they don't have to breathe very big to get to the maximum inspiratory capacity of their lungs. So that's why the spontaneous tidal volumes are kind of small. So the other thing to keep in mind is if you add pressure support, if the patient takes a spontaneous breath during that T high, then their peak pressure is going to go up. Let's say your P high is set at 28 and you set 5 of pressure support. During the spontaneous breath, that pressure is going to go up to 33 centimeters of pressure. So the question is, do you really want to add that extra pressure for tidal volumes that really don't need to be increased at this point? Now, as you wean, and we'll talk about that in the next video, then there might be an option or a time that you would like to put in the pressure support. But generally, during the initial phases or when the patient's on very extreme settings, I sure wouldn't recommend it because, like I said, it will increase the overall peak inspiratory pressure during a spontaneous breath. So if you've been watching several of my videos, you know once you see this screen, the show is over. That's right, that's the end of Aprv Part 3. Now again, I'm going to remind you, if you're digging these videos, man, just please click the like button and please subscribe. If you subscribe, you'll keep updated on when the new videos come out. Let me talk about my websites. I'm sure you've heard about them before, but we'll cover it again. www.$10cu.ning.com. All the content on that site is free. We've got blogs. We've got forums that you can discuss with certain topics with people. You can see the links to our videos on there. All kinds of cool free stuff. We try to give as much free content as humanly possible to you. Now, if you go to www.$10ceu.com, you can take a CEU course for just $10. And yes, we have the Aprv course available on that site. And here's the trick. It's a little secret. Don't tell anybody I told you this. If you've watched all of the videos for Aprv on these YouTube videos, you can go ahead and go on $10ceu.com. So go ahead and pay for that course. And you don't have to watch the video again. Fast forward through it. But the last couple of seconds you're going to watch, because as soon as it ends, it's going to automatically click over to a post-test that you got to take. And the test is easy. I don't make this tough, but it's a requirement. You got to take it. If it's not a live CEU, you have to take a test in order for you to get the ARC approval for that CEU, okay? So please, we're trying to give you the free content, but we do need money in order to keep our sites going, so support us. Take the class. You need CEUs anyway. And you've already watched the video. Why waste the time watching the video and not get the CEU for it? Don't make sense. All right, man. We'll be chatting with you all soon.